Afternoon now, everyone. I'm Rebecca. I've met lots of you at different WiRP events, but I'm a partner here at Anstey. I've been chair of Women in Residential Property since May, so relatively new, working alongside Emma and the Today's Media team. And I run a team of residential conveyancers dealing with all aspects and different types of residential property.
Thank you, Rebecca. And Sirah?
Hello, I'm Sirah Parks. I'm the Senior Regional Managing Surveyor at SDL Surveyors. We have about 130 surveyors across the whole of the UK. I'm also Chair of the East Midlands Regional Advisory Board for the RICS.
Jamie? Oh, where's Jamie gone? Okay, I think we've temporarily lost one of our speakers. I'm sure she'll be back with us shortly. Jodie Fraser.
Hi, I'm Jodie Fraser, Managing Director at JMJ Asset Management, which is covering the Southwest. I deal predominantly with the residential leasehold space, and block management, that sort of thing. And I also am the head of the block management advisory group for women in residential property. So it's great to be here.
Lovely, thank you, Jodie. And Jamie, is Jamie back with us? Okay, I'll very, very briefly introduce Jamie in the hope that she can join us again shortly.
Yeah, I think she's popped out. I think she's trying to rejoin.
Okay, fine. Jamie is the operations director for a business called Complete ASAP, and they are the UK's largest sales progression specialists. So hopefully I have said exactly what Jamie was going to say there. Before we start with the panel discussion, we are going to run a very, very simple poll, which should be coming up in your chat at some point. Please do take a couple of minutes to respond to these questions. Your responses will be anonymous. What we're trying to do is build up over time a really good assessment of sentiment on the front line of the residential property industry. So we'd be really grateful for your responses. We're not going to do anything with your data. We're not going to share your names, but do take the time to respond to those. So, first question. I'm sure all of you have been watching the coverage very closely of the government's announcement regarding changes to the home purchase process. There is a consultation that is ongoing. Rebecca, what are your views on that government consultation and indeed what the government is suggesting needs to change?
Thanks, Emma. So I've pulled out a couple of key points which from a legal sector position sort of are really interesting to us. I think first and foremost, we welcome any change that involves both an evolution of how we convey, how we deal with the home and buying and selling process, and anything that promotes efficiency and a better experience for our clients has to be good, right? There's a couple of points that I'm really interested to get into with the consultation. First one being around upfront information. Very conscious that Beth Rudolph's on this call, which makes me very nervous when I talk about detail when it comes to government consultation, but welcome, Beth. Upfront information is all about providing information and saving costs for clients selling properties, and trying to avoid the fallouts and the abortive matters that fall through, and giving transparency and clarity on the assets that people are buying, which is a great thing. We've seen lots of debate around this, particularly around material information and what that means. And I think that there's a valid question around how different is this to the proposition with HIPs and home information packs. Governments are trying to address that by talking about things like the longevity of the data and the quality of the information that are in the packs. But I think a number of us would question sort of how different this is to those proposals. The upfront information part is not too dissimilar from what we do with auctions, and we're seeing a rise and an increase in auctions where you do provide more information about the property and you also provide searches. So I think first and foremost, what we would want is that we really get into the consultation and the government listens to some of the logistical challenges on that. We're all very used to lots of kind of rushed legislation or ill thought through practical considerations that in practice then are actually prohibitive or problematic and don't achieve the aims of being efficient or more transparent. So I think it's really important that through that process we really work through those challenges. Another part of the consultation is around the digitisation and using AI and technology, which is also really welcome. I think there's a lot of challenges around that because there are lots of solutions that, well, the legal services market is quite fragmented from large firms with big big investment in things like IT and technology and platforms, right through to smaller SMEs and small firms that don't necessarily have that same budget. So that the sort of fragmentation of that market is quite difficult sometimes when it comes to digitization and people's ability to move and evolve with that, but also legacy systems and where technology is not set up for connectivity. I'm really encouraged by some of the solutions that I see that come in that are encouraging a network between lots of different stakeholders. So some of the people like LMS and PEXA are really trying to tackle those challenges. But there's lots of solutions for digitizations in the market, lots of solutions for different types of problems along the property chains. But bringing everything together and connecting everyone really does present a challenge because of some of those kind of logistical issues. The other thing I think is quite interesting and one up for debate is around binding sale contracts and people paying what is effectively a reservation fee or a penalty if people pull out of transactions, and how much of a deterrent that is. I think from a legal point of view, you have conversations that you go from, well, what does that mean in terms of consumer choice, or where it's not do you enter into conditional contracts, or do you have certain scenarios where people can pull out of those arrangements without any penalty? So I think definitely working through the scenarios in that sense. But positively, if it does help with the number of fall throughs and people being committed to contracts, I think there is more work that can be done there. And probably also the other one I would just point out would be around the AML. What we have seen, if we've not seen much in the way of property legislation change, certainly in the 30 years that I've been in the industry, what we have seen is AML change and the increasing burden there. I think the ability for us to share that either identity or source of funds information through the chain and the various different stakeholders would be really beneficial to clients. Incredibly frustrating have to provide that information to multiple different stakeholders, and up until now we haven't been able to share that information because our various regulators all have either different requirements or don't share that information or allow us to rely. But I see that part of the consultation is around the proposal that the FCA might assume responsibility for supervision on that, meaning that there is some ability to share that information, and that would be a real game changer, I think, for the experience of those clients. There's lots in there. I could go on about it, but I'm not going to, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I hope this is a reasonable summary. Please correct me if not, but government needs to listen and engage and make sure we have a properly informed consultation process. I think anybody who's having to pick up some of the issues following the implementation of the Building Safety Act would support that. How do we ensure a standardised framework and level playing field given varying sizes of firms and also the impact of legacy systems? Binding contracts, how do we make them meaningful? And there should be some interesting lessons to learn perhaps from some of the early adopters of those. And then finally AML, which I'm sure is something that everybody is aware of the challenges with, whether you're at the coalface of the industry or moved house. But how do we streamline that process so the information can be shared once rather than having to redo the checks multiple times? Jamie, as a sales progression business, and I did introduce you earlier in your
apologies,
absence.
the whole office internet went down literally as we started, so typical. So I'm currently hotspotting.
As a sales progression business, you probably more than anybody else deal with the challenges of an inefficient home moving process on a daily basis. What are
Yeah.
your thoughts around the recommendations the government's made?
We welcome them. So the focus on reforming the process, anything that encourages greater transparency, consistency, and communication between the parties, it can only improve it for buyers and sellers. So from an operational point of view, we see every single day, like you just said, fragmented communication and limited upfront information, and how that can then slow it down unnecessarily going forward. So the emphasis on digitalisation and upfront data, and basically the better alignment between conveyancers, agents, lenders, reflects what we've been advocating for years. So I do agree, though, with obviously what Rebecca said as well. However, the success of it will depend on genuine collaboration across everybody involved, not just new regulation. So I believe the technology already exists, but what's missing is shared accountability and standardization in how the information is actually exchanged. We have actually ourselves implemented material information to speed up our transactions, but then what we found is if it's not adopted by the entire chain, it doesn't have the significant effects that it would otherwise. So overall, the view is positive, but provided the consultation leads to practical, consistent change that then supports people that are actually doing the work on the ground. So moving from conversation to actual implementation.
I think it's a really important point, Jamie, you make about the impact of one part of the chain or two parts of the chain doing things differently to the rest of the chain, or even the challenges of transacting different types of property in a chain. Well, you might have one that's leasehold, you've got one that's freehold, you might have one that's a second home, you might have one that's probate, and how you align all of those different needs and challenges into an efficient process is something that I suspect, even with these government recommendations, we could be struggling with for many years. Jodie, my view, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, is that the block and estate management profession is quite often omitted from these discussions. The impact of a leasehold property in a transaction can sometimes be quite significant, particularly where we've had, for example, issues with cladding. But your profession has to provide a huge amount of information to inform the process. What are your industry's responses to the consultation?
I think, speaking personally from my own experience, we are, as an industry, we are often left out of these conversations, or maybe an afterthought. There are, correct me if I'm wrong, over 5 million leasehold properties in the, in England and Wales, or possibly, across the UK. But, from a leasehold perspective, there are so many touch points where the managing agent has to get involved during the sales process, but we're often only contacted right at the end of that process. And therefore everything is done in such a rush. And then we're seen as the bottleneck, ultimately, of, withholding information. We're not withholding information. We just have a lot of information that we have to provide. Rebecca, you mentioned earlier about seeing the rise in auction, flats going to auction. And I've personally seen on multiple occasions when a flat has been sold at auction, when an LPE1 management pack has not even been requested. And then, a leaseholder has moved into the property with historic arrears. They don't know about a cladding issue. They don't know about a building safety issue. They don't know that there's absolutely no reserve fund, but there's major works potentially due because of X, Y, and Z. And, I think, we have to, what we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis in terms of block management and leasehold has to be considered in this consultation, because it's a massive part of the sales process, and we just don't get included until the very end. And at that point, the person is already invested in buying that property. The person who's selling has already gone through multiple processes to get to that point when we then get involved. And often we're therefore the bearer of bad news, because we have to then say, well, actually, there's a cladding project, or there's this, that, and the other. And sometimes those sales fall through because that hasn't been disclosed at the outset. It's a difficult one.
Jodie, do you sense that enough is understood about the questions that a potential purchaser of leasehold should ask, but also perhaps estate agents should be asking at the start of the process. Do you get, as a business, or are you used to getting good informed questions, or not?
Not really, no. And I think, you know, again, for me, what I've seen over the years is, you know, if you look on Rightmove, for example, as a you know, and look at the information that is put on there, you know, you might get the length of the lease, you might get the service charge contribution, but you won't get all of the ins and outs of, you know, if there's major works going on, if there's any service charge disputes between neighbours, if there are fire door replacements that are currently ongoing, which actually isn't the, you know, the responsibility of the managing agent, because the lease will dictate otherwise. But there's a dispute with that, you know, and this I'm all for upfront information, because, as I said earlier, once you get to the point of the managing agent getting involved, it's gone through multiple processes. There's offers, there's surveys that have been done, there's searches that have been done, and then it's, oh, quickly, we need to get an LPE1 form completed. And, you know, we're expected to potentially do that overnight in some instances. But no, you know, I'm all for upfront information, but obviously the information that we do provide has to come with a fee. And is the person selling going to pay that fee right at the beginning, when they don't even have a buyer potentially at that point, which may come across as, you know, not that you don't want to disclose it, but you also don't want to put buyers off. But actually, if you put that information out there from the offset, that buyer is making a very informed decision, whereas you're not emotionally invested at that point, and therefore, you know, it comes as a bit of a shock later down the line when that information is disclosed, and, you know, potentially things start to come crashing down. So we do need to be involved right from the beginning. But we also have to provide a hell of a lot of information, and that information has to come at a fee, because it's our time at the end of the day.
I think one of the key things with this as well is that the people who are viewing that information, whether that be a professional or somebody who's thinking about purchasing that home, actually understand what they're looking at.
Yeah.
And some of what we're talking about serving up, some of what we already serve up, flood risk data, for example, is very rarely as black and white as what we look at on the screen. We need to understand how to interpret that, both in the context of the house, but also in the context of the way we're going to use the home. And I think there's a huge amount more education that's needed around that, whether that's how people interpret a condition report through to how they interpret what's in the LPE1. Sirah, surveying.
Hello.
Hello.
Well, I mean, SDL and the RICS obviously strongly support this reform. And I strongly echo what Jamie, Jodie and Rebecca have said. As surveyors, we go out and we're expected to provide information for lenders to base their lending, their underwriting process on. Transaction delays and fall throughs, I mean, they're saying there's nearly 1 in 3 that cause significant financial and emotional stress. And obviously in our professional lives, we're seeing inquiries that come in later down the line. So we have to readjust perhaps the valuation, or even for some lenders say, in that case, it's not going to be suitable for your lending purposes. So the reforms have got to focus on reducing those main risks. I think just for the people that are in the system who are not professionals as we are, it's such an emotive process, but we are the ones that get the flack when it goes wrong, and we cannot see what's coming down the tracks a lot of the time. So upfront information, property condition reports, I welcome. I spent 5 years up in Scotland. We had a fantastic, and still do have a great system up there where the information is put together. And Rebecca, you're right, it is the vendor's responsibility to meet those upfront costs. But what I would add to that is that not all sales fall through because the purchasers change their mind. Sometimes vendors change their minds, and it can be for all sorts of reasons. So that may, and I don't know what the statistics are, but that may take out some of those vendors who are just testing the market or seeing whether they would like to move or not. My surveyors and I go out all the time to do valuations, and we ask about how much interest have you had, how many offers, and there's a varying level of that, of course, depending on the property, but you will get a lot of people who will say, well, we're really keen to sell ours, but the one we want, the vendor's refusing to move on, or they're not providing the information, or they still haven't filled out their seller's pack information. So I think whilst upfront information is great, and people generally look at the professionals and say, well, we're not collaborating, we're not aligning, very often it is down to vendors who are just not providing the information, whether it's because they're not aware or it's not that important to them. Professional standards, mandatory qualifications, it's a little bit of an inflammatory talking point, isn't it? Because a lot of estate agents have said, well, we don't want to have to take on any more professional qualifications, but I do feel that there is a need to upgrade that for sure in the industry. We need to be competent, regulated surveyors. So we, I think, need competent and regulated professionals throughout the whole house buying and selling process. Digitisation and responsible AI adoption. I mean, the RICS have just produced the world's first AI standard in surveying. It's a great document. I'd recommend that you take a read of that. And whether we like it or not, AI is here to stay. As Rebecca touched on earlier, we do have legacy platforms, but we need to update absolutely everything. And we need to accept that if we have that increase and upping of standards across the whole industry that are involved in house buying and selling, then the adoption of AI will not be such a frightening prospect, because it will be people who are held to account that are, if they're using it, need to know that what the information is that's going in is absolutely correct and it has formal underpinning. So the parallel consultation on material information, that's an important step. I mean, the RICS has long advocated for clear standardised property information that's accessible from the outset. And I think as professionals, again, we've all echoed that. And also the RICS is simultaneously updating the home survey standard. So that's going to align beautifully with these reforms. It just ensures clarity of service levels, consistent consumer protection across the UK, and all of us on that call are pro that. And I just think through member engagement, working parties, and all of us adopting these new standards, it's a positive.
Thank you, Sirah. And I just want to emphasise something that you mentioned there, which was your reference to vendors changing their mind. And I think something that we all need to reflect on as we're talking about transformation is that life happens.
Yeah.
And you cannot legislate out life happening, and you can't legislate out human behaviour.
Yeah.
And equally, it's also very difficult to legislate things out like a mortgage interest rate rise, meaning that for whatever reason, property no longer becomes affordable. And I think that plays straight back to, I think, the point you made, Rebecca, about how do we make binding contracts meaningful, but actually how do we also keep them flexible enough to allow for a divorce or a child suddenly needing to move school or somebody's job changing. Sirah, just quickly before we move on to the next question, you mentioned that you'd spent quite a lot of time working in Scotland. What is the most important lesson you think we could learn from the Scottish system? Because what we're talking about introducing is very similar.
I'm very pro the Scottish system, and I know that because we have the HIPPAC trial down here, it wasn't, it just wasn't a success for whatever reason. Now, I've been on a couple of roundtables within the RICS where they're asking members to come in and give their experiences, and the one strong reference point is the system in Scotland. In Scotland, they have adopted a standardised contract. So that's something that all lawyers adhere to, we agree it, and they check all the information across that. And if you have 28 days, basically, once you've put an offer in, to conclude your missives, which is exchange and complete the contracts. It's a standardized contract, and you're absolutely right. There are clauses in there that if you do have a death, if you cannot financially continue, if something has happened, then you can pull out with no financial penalty. And that has to be understood, that in Scotland it isn't the day that you put the offer in, it's legally binding and it's fixed, and you'll have to pay the deposit or you'll lose a deposit. The difference in Scotland is there is a proper survey, a condition report that you can have a look at. The searches are done. There's a standardised contract that the lawyers have all agreed to and go through. So it's only, as you mentioned earlier, Emma, you are going to get a variety of different properties, and the uses for those are going to be different. So it's a case of checking. So, for instance, if you want it as a second home, but there's a covenant to say it can only ever be lived in by a family who live there full time, it's things like that that will be apparent from the information pack. Talking about Jodie mentioned the lack of information on leasehold properties. It's not a problem in Scotland. There's a lot of leasehold properties. There's a lot of freehold flats. There's a lot of leasehold houses. So the basics are slightly different. The vernacular architecture across the board is relatively similar. So I don't believe that by adopting this, it's going to be any more complex than the Scottish system has proven works, keeps the transactions moving along. All of us on this call, it will make our work lives so much easier by having that information. But equally, we are all buyers or renters of property, so we see it from both sides. So I think the take home is that having upfront information, having a standardized contract, they're the two things that really will make this work. And I echo the points that were made earlier. We don't want the government to send this out into our professional lives where we put in the effort, the energy, the retraining, the qualification building, for them to then do a U-turn and say, actually, again, it's a little bit difficult, or it doesn't align with our political backers. We're going to stop this.
Okay. Thank you, Sirah. Before we move on to the next question, which relates to activity levels, we've got a couple of questions from our audience. So I'm going to throw these out, and if anybody wants to answer them, do. If nobody does want to answer them, we'll just move quickly on. First question is from Alan. Would the panel agree that banning referral fees would be a big step forwards in improving the home buying and selling industry? Shall I kick off?
Happily.
I'm not going to kick off.
Go on then, yeah.
You
go and I'll follow.
I think there's been an awful lot of noise made about referral fees, and one of the biggest areas of referral fees that is so very, very often overlooked is that relating to insurance. And if we altered the way that we insured the risk in a residential property transaction, not only would we probably greatly reduce the cost for everybody involved, but I also think that we'd very quickly end up with a very different looking transaction. So I'm not going to comment on referral fees, but I would suggest that if anybody is looking at that as part of this process, they also look at the insurance model throughout the transaction. Is it Rebecca?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. I mean, for full disclosure, my firm doesn't have any relationships that involve referral fees, just in terms of where we're coming from. But I guess it's whether the question relates to, is the inference on referral fees around the quality of the legal services provided as a result of those relationships, or is it the overall cost as a result of the referral fees being coming into play in the transactions? I think those are two different things. Cost wise, actually, when you look at, whenever I look at some of these arrangements, when you add together the referral fees and then what the legal supplier and then what the supplier management party is charging, it kind of amounts to what we end up charging if you're not in that business anyway. So I'm not sure that it increased the overall cost to the consumer, because actually it's just built in a slightly different way. But I do take the point around, I think it's the concerns around either quality or transparency to the consumer are really valid. You know, there are lots of firms that have their commercial gearing and their structuring that works and depends very much on these referral relationships for a, you know, stream of business coming through that are really good quality and do a really good job. I think what's encouraging, I'm not sure it's the referral fee per se. I think what we should focus on is the kind of the quality and what the consumer is getting as a result, and that they have a good ability to choose transparently who they work with. One of the things proposed in the consultation, which is quite interesting, is around more information and publication of information around estate agents and conveyancers, including things like expertise and performance and process, to allow those consumers to choose appropriate services. So I think that would be a really good thing, because it's educating and sharing information about the quality of firms and the quality of services. I'm not quite sure how the proposal is to look at that. We've obviously already got things like, you know, online ratings, Trustpilot, all of that some firms use as a good sort of measure of that feedback. But I am really intrigued that the consultation proposes to take a look at that, and I think that is linked to the referral fee point.
Lovely. Thank you, Rebecca. Rather than throwing that question open to the rest of the panel, because we've still got quite a lot to cover, I've got one more question, which is from Ruth. Ruth, thank you. This is a really good question. I don't know whether anybody on our panel is going to have a view on this, so let's see how we get on. If upfront information is to become mandatory, who, if anyone, should regulate the data / standards?
I'll have a go at that one, Emma. I think we need each industry to regulate and be responsible for their information that they pull forward. If I was to ask for a title, I would expect the provider of that title, the platform of that title, to make sure it was correct and up to date, notwithstanding that sometimes people have bought an extra piece of land which is then wrapped up. But we need titles, particularly leasehold information. Those who put it into the platforms, it needs to be up to date. So it's going to be, I guess, siloed for each platform provider, information provider to be regulated, to make sure it's up to date.
It's a really interesting question, Ruth, and I just wonder, and I haven't looked into this, but I know it's been referenced for years in this industry, whether we can learn anything from, I'm guessing there is regulation and standards pertaining to the storage of information on our cars and how things like faults are recorded every time we go for an MOT. Now, I fully appreciate that a house is far more complex than a vehicle, but I don't know whether there's something that can be learned from that. Thank you to the panel, and thank you to everybody who's asked questions on that. We're going to move on to our next question now, which relates to sort of activity levels. Now, a slightly different question. Jodie, I'm going to come to you first on this. Thinking about block management specifically, what are the sort of key trends that you're seeing in the industry that are really either driving change or creating challenge, or perhaps even creating opportunities?
I think with ever-changing legislation across the board, certainly in terms of reform, we are seeing a lot of change, mandatory qualifications potentially being one. But I do think that we also have to think about the timeline that it's taking to provide information throughout the process. But I think we are seeing flats being sold quite quickly in the sector, but they're not processing quickly, if you see what I mean. So I think, as I said earlier, there seems to be a bit of a bottleneck, which coincidentally obviously lands with us as agents or within the leasehold sector. But this is where the information is coming in that is obviously causing that bottleneck, because it's causing that problem. So you know, in the areas that I manage and have seen over the years, sort of mainly in the southwest, you know, we are seeing flats being sold quite quickly, and the trends are you know, are showing that, but the process seems to be taking a really long time to, you know, to get through anything.
Are you seeing, or are you aware of challenges being seen with things like sale of properties, perhaps where there's not cladding remediation, but there's concerns over fire safety for whatever reason? Are you seeing more questions around things like reserve funds, just because the profile of reserve funds is being raised by LAFRA?
Yeah, I think, you know, we certainly, I mean, I always advocate for a reserve fund anyway, but an educated plan around that. You know, when you're budgeting, don't just chuck money here, there, and everywhere, because you might need to do something. You know, have a plan around that. And I think that's where, you know, the upfront information will help if agents are proactive with showing why there's a reserve fund and why you're planning for X, Y, and Z in the future. But yeah, there's certainly more questions arising over things like that, and questions arising over you know, there's a high focus on anything over 18 meters for obvious reasons, but that is coming down the line now for the smaller buildings, which shouldn't be forgotten just because they're under 18 meters or under 11 meters. You know, we still need to consider the fire risk in those buildings in the same way as we would a high rise. But I am certainly starting to see more questions coming in around the fire risk assessments, for example. You know, have the actions been done? If not, why not? Those kinds of questions. Thank you,
Jodie. Sirah, if you could cover sort of what you're seeing in terms of activity levels as the second part of this question. My first part is, as surveyors going out to perform evaluation for lending, to what extent do you have access to all the information that you need when it's a leasehold property to take account of, for example, there being no reserve fund on a building that might need a lot of work doing to it?
We don't get given that information. So what if we're lucky, when we go out, we have the length of the lease remaining or when it started, ground rent and service charges, and that's it. So we don't have any information about any planned works. Usually our surveyors will have a look at a building, they have a look at its overall condition and whether it's being maintained adequately, and then they'll go back and ask the questions by way of part of their reporting to the lender. If they have significant concerns, so for instance, if there's cladding, they'll call for an EWS1. And if there is one for the building, then that's usually post valuation and inspection. It's a big problem for us. We'd rather have the information up front, because then we can take a view on that. We get a lot of post-valuation queries around flats and leases, where our information then changes. We have to amend the report. Now, if you're halfway through a sale by that point, somebody's invested in that, they're emotionally already moved in, they've spent significant funds, and then they have to go and look for something else. Not least, the vendor is then sat there thinking, well, even I didn't understand the implications of the situation I'm in.
Okay. Very interesting that you don't see the information before you do evaluation, and nobody does. Activity levels, Sirah, what are you seeing? What's hot and what's not?
What's hot and what's not? Well, we've got 130 surveyors across the whole of the UK, including Northern Ireland. My surveyors who go from the Welsh borders to the Norfolk coast and north of London, I have a call with them every week. I tend to kind of pick up on market trends fortnightly with them. So at the moment, I mean, they're all saying that house sales are slowing. In some areas across the central belt of England, they have pockets of good activity, and they always will do, because they'll always be those ones that have got the good transport links or the better schools. I think also where it's slumping, it could be because of the impending budget, but cost of living and the world socioeconomic issues, they're always going to impact people. And certainly different areas where you get the more academic cities, they tend to be more cautious with what's going on around the world. Other areas, they're just what's going on in my world, and can I afford it? Do I like the front door? Am I going to go for it? So I think mortgage rates are more stable, and some lenders are also reducing their fixed rates, as we've seen, and they're also increasing the loan to value ratios, so that's helping. We traditionally saw the autumn market slow up before COVID anyway, and then during and post-COVID, the market's been fluid all year round, hasn't it? So I think what we're seeing now is maybe not a slowing as much as just we're going back to a more traditional buying and selling market. So it's probably just a correction, and I like to call it, people call it a fallback, I like to call it a fall forward. We're just going into something that's more traditional, and if we cast our minds back 6 years, it lines with that. Rental properties, not so hot. A lot of landlords are pulling out of the older sectors, the older housing stock sectors, because of the changes in EPC rating. But we are, funnily enough, seeing new builds are really busy, and the new build providers, the builders, are not offering so many incentives now. They used to offer absolutely everything, including a Labrador and a Porsche in the garage. Now, not so. You do still get some areas where they give you a 5% deposit, but not even that. And I'm wondering whether, if landlords are getting out of the older housing stock because of EPC requirements, they might be then going into the new build, smaller properties that are more rentable. So that might be why the new build house builders are seeing a surge. And again, cost of living, utility bills going up, people are maybe not so in love with older housing stocks that cost more to run and maintain, and that might be another reason why we're seeing new builds demand increasing. But I guess what could come out of landlords pulling out of older housing stocks that traditionally have been the cheaper price bands is it may well give first-time buyers a bit more stock availability. A first-time buyer with an older house that needs more heating and maintenance are not always the best combination. But we might see ourselves, because we all bought a drafty old dated mid-terrace house as our first house, and maybe we might see a bit of a correction against there.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you, Sirah. Really interesting what you say about new builds. Rebecca, if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask you to, if you're able to, just talk a little bit about what your team's seeing in terms of new builds.
Yeah, sure. So very much the same as Sirah says. I think that where we see the new build activity is either first-time buyer market for those reasons, really good in terms of energy efficiency. Lots of developers really focused on sustainability, and so therefore the operating costs of those assets are a lot lower. Similarly, for the same reason, lots of investors coming into that territory for that reason, where the assets are low maintenance, good energy rating, low operating costs vis-a-vis older assets, and I guess that's where we're seeing that sort of consequential increase in things like the auctions, again because of the various sort of more tightening of regulation around landlords and the quality of homes and sustainability and all of that. What we're seeing is lots of those assets either from institutional investors or assets coming into probate, where they do require a lot of work. It will take them quite a lot of capital to bring it up to current either lettable standards or to become energy efficient, to reduce those operating costs. So we're most certainly seeing that. There's also some really interesting sort of themes around houses in multiple occupations. So investors are really interested now in, and I think again because a lot of these assets are not caught by the BSA regulations. So a house in multiple applications, say 6, 7 or 8 rooms, investing in those types of assets and then creating professional co-living spaces. So these are quite popular popular in areas where there is you know, young professional demographic, where co-living in a arrangement where there is, you know, a modern asset which is inexpensive to then run because it's had the renovation works, really popular in where there's either universities or professional. That's a good sweet spot for investors at the moment, that we're seeing that's an alternative way of that particular demographic owning assets in response to what's going on with the rental market. So and much the same in terms of the non-new build market, you know, pretty sluggish, pretty static for all the reasons Sirah has said, despite the interest rates. And I think everyone's holding out for what's going to go on with taxation and budget. It will, I think we'll still get the seasonality. Christmas is always busy for us, particularly because we do a lot of new build and there's a lot of year end there. But it never ceases to surprise me how everyone wants to move into a new house 2 days before Christmas. So my team are ready to get busy for that. But yeah, very much along the same themes, Emma.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Jamie, if you could respond quickly on activity levels. We've only got 10 minutes left, but I'd really be interested to hear from you, Jamie, on sort of challenges you're seeing and opportunities.
Yeah, challenges. Well, I've spoken to the sales progressors prior to this, because obviously we have got a team of over 30 progressors and we cover across the country, so it's interesting to know what they're finding coming up. But the things that came up often from them, which have already been mentioned, is the EWS1 forms. A lot of them for some reason seem to be coming up to the expiry date, or I know there was an incident with Tri-Fire, which obviously they needed to be redone, which caused massive delays. Delays with land registry in general, so turnaround times not being given but then not adhered to either, and I think they get escalated as urgent, and then but most get escalated as urgent, so it makes no real difference. Lot of deed variations still on properties, as they're required by lenders, so again that's slowing things up because there's numerous third parties that then need to approve these deed variations, get them signed, and it's taking longer. A lot of freehold properties on newer developments that require management packs because of the managed areas, so again that adds another stage in the transaction to cause a delay. So, but trend wise, most recently we've heard a lot from our estate agent clients that the stock's high, however sales are now slowing down, basically holding off until after the budget announcement, but it could also be in relation to going back to a normal seasonal trend as well. But yeah, that's the main things that we're seeing.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Jodie, interesting that a couple of the things that Jamie's referenced there cross over into the territory of block and estate management as well. But Jodie, you mentioned earlier the likelihood of sort of mandatory qualifications coming down the line. I think that's probably a challenge, but actually a great opportunity for your industry. But what else are you seeing in terms of challenges right now?
Challenges, I think there's a little bit of industry challenge across the wider property industry, and you know I'm not one for I'm all for collaboration, put it that way. You know, I don't see any need for the blame game, but I do see a lot of challenges where you'll have a conveyancer will blame the estate agent, and the estate agent will blame the managing agent, and then whereas actually we're all on the same team, we're all trying to get the sale through for because nobody wants that irate phone call from the person who's selling, or even the person who's buying, saying why can't I move in 2 days before Christmas because you're holding it up, kind of scenario. I'd just like to see a little bit more collaboration across the board. And I actually believe that it's just a lack of understanding, of what each of us do and what each of our own individual challenges are, as from a block management industry across to, the estate agents. The estate agents have obviously got targets to hit. They want to get that through. They want to get it through as quickly as possible. But from a leasehold perspective, we have, as I said earlier, a hell of a lot of information that we have to provide, and we have to provide it accurately. Otherwise, it obviously is going to come back to us. And sometimes there might not be that information because we've just taken over a development, for example, and we're still waiting on handover information but that property is halfway through the process of being sold. So, I'm not going to sit here and, I just don't want to see the blame game anymore. And I think that that's where we all need to just step up and accept that we all need to support each other.
I think, Jodie, there's a little bit of a myth that goes around that all of the information that you need to complete an LPA1 form is magically stored in some huge central repository that every single block manager uses and that everybody updates. That can you just, that myth's not true, is it?
It's not true. And I wish it was just a bit of photocopying, as I've heard thrown at me a few times. And if you've done 10 LP1 forms on the same block and it's all very simple, then yes, of course it's a quicker process than it is if you've, as I just said, just taken over that development, or there's a cladding issue, or there's an insurance issue, or there's historic service charge disputes with, there's arrears collection issues. It's not always a very straightforward process. And for us as well, we're all really busy, so we don't want to be sat, holding things up as you might get the blame for. But ultimately, we want the process to go smoothly, and I wish there was a centralized system that we could just click a button and here you are, here's the information. But it's just not. That's just not true.
Would make insurance much easier, Jodie, as well.
It certainly would.
Jodie, thank you so much, because what you've brilliantly covered there is challenge and an opportunity and your ask, which is around greater collaboration. Rebecca, very quickly, if you can, biggest challenge, biggest opportunity and your ask.
Okay, so I think that the biggest challenge is just listening to Jodie echo with all of what you say. I think a lot of it is the sequencing of all of this in the process. And I was hearing you talk earlier about, well, everyone comes to us last and we don't get told until right towards the end. And I'm sat here thinking, that's because we go right back to the AML problem. So before we can come out to you to get the information, we've got to get all of the ID and all the source of funds done, get the client, get the monies on account, and then get that paid over to you before the information. So a lot of this is sequencing. And I think the opportunity and the ask is two things, is throughout the consultation process for us to really dig into that sequencing and, as you say, Jodie, understand the component parts, the logistics and the sequencing, and how we tackle those things as a collective, because it's often everyone, we're in our nucleus of what parts affect the part of the process, and actually the only person that suffers is the consumer or the client, because it just takes too long in the end. But I don't think we ever really get into kind of multi-party discussions about why it is those delays happen from different handoffs between the different stakeholders. So I think the consultation should really dig in, and my ask is for the government to see it through. And the reason I ask that is because we've had so many attempts at various different ways in which we can improve the home buying and selling process, from some of us that were involved in all of this years ago, right through from Chain Matrix to VEO to HIPS to all these different initiatives. And sometimes as an industry, we're our own worst nightmare, because we talk ourselves out of it by finding problems and not solutions. So I think my ask would be to see it through, and for us as an industry to find solutions to what are, yes, complex issues, but to find the solutions to that.
Thank you, Rebecca. Jamie, your ask.
My ask, well, I was going to start with the challenge in relation to managing expectations, really. There's so many different moving parts that are outside all of our direct control. So literally what Jodie said, really, people don't really understand what needs to be done, and it's more education around that. I think we need to prepare sellers and buyers for what is necessary on their behalf to make things move forward. It's also cultural, really, because there's a lot. I know it's been mentioned to me a few times that Amazon affect people expecting instant things to happen, which isn't the case in conveyancing at all. So another area which we haven't touched on but would be capacity management within the business. it's such a fluctuating industry, and it's really important to get it right if you're running a business. Obviously, we focus heavily on the forecasting and understanding the trends, but at the minute these trends are a bit all over the place. So it's forward planning recruitment is really difficult. So that's one of my challenges. Opportunity and ask really is professionalizing the sales progression function. So understanding the real value that it can deliver for everybody. Technology, it obviously is massively important, and it can make data available for everybody involved, and it is a chance to then transform what's seen as a reactive role into proactive, something that can then spot bottlenecks and move it forward. And it can obviously, tech can automate things as well to free up people's time to be more involved with the customer and making that journey a lot more positive for them, which we manage a lot of the time, but not always, because, well, we all know here that it can be a really difficult time for people. But it is exciting for sales progression. If we embrace the innovation and consistency, then we can basically redefine what good looks like. And similar as well, what Rebecca said, actually follow through. That's the ask of the government. Follow through with it. Standardised frameworks for property data and communication, an industry-wide standard for how information is shared between every party that's involved. And it's available from day one, like we've all mentioned. And also, we have touched on it, formal qualifications, just more standardised training across the board. That's something we're keen on. We put our sales progressors through a CESP qualification, because we want them to be qualified sales progressors, and it does mean something to us.
Thank you, Jamie. And I'm very sorry because we are running out of time, but I'm going to give Sirah the last couple of minutes.
Mine's really quick. So our challenge is capacity to have sufficiently qualified and experienced surveyors with sound building mythology to be able to do the volume of surveys that are going to come in. Greatest, I have got more, but I'll keep it to my top 10. Greatest opportunity, well, adjacent upskilling with carbon capture, EPC, retrofit awareness, building mythology. It's a great opportunity. We're going to have to learn, and we're going to have to get nimble and pivot as the markets change, and hopefully this does go through. So we're going to have to decide how best we're going to report for lenders and for buyers. Big ask, again, as I said earlier, please don't U-turn government. We don't need that at this stage. We need them once and for all to continue with the process. Prop tech or data suppliers, I've got a really quick one for them because we haven't really talked about them, that we ask for all leasehold details and confirmation. It's provided on all platforms for all of us, along with titles that are accurate and up to date. Service charge, ground rent details, I mean, they should be compulsory as a minimum when advertising a leasehold property, and it would certainly help all of us on this call with our parts that we play within the house buying and selling roles. So that's me. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sirah. Audience, I'm very sorry that we don't have time for any more questions. If there is anything you want to raise in terms of a question of our panel, if you put your queries through to hello@womeninresidentialproperty.co.uk, I will make sure that they get sent on to the right person. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. You've been absolutely fantastic. Quite a lot of consistency in what you've been saying, which when we talk about an industry that a lot of people think about is siloed, is perhaps actually not the case. The response to the polls have been really, really interesting. I think actually reflecting perhaps a little bit uncertainty. So we're predicting by a small majority an increase in transactions in the next year. Perhaps that's reflecting on Sirah's comments about the sale of some rental property to first-time buyers. A decrease in property prices, 57% think there's going to be a decrease. General happiness, we're split. Probably we're all a little bit happier than we are not. Be really interesting to see how that tracks over the next quarter as we go through winter. I know it could be a gloomy time of year, but we've got a budget in the middle as well, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Thank you very, very much, everybody. Next one of these discussions is the 2nd of February.
Afternoon now, everyone. I'm Rebecca. I've met lots of you at different WiRP events, but I'm a partner here at Anstey. I've been chair of Women in Residential Property since May, so relatively new, working alongside Emma and the Today's Media team. And I run a team of residential conveyancers dealing with all aspects and different types of residential property.